Hello, and welcome back for episode 4.
Welcome.
So today I had a book that I'd like to discuss. So this is The Awakened Brain by Lisa Miller. And she is a clinical psychologist. And the tagline of the book is The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. And in the book, she talks about how she had this clinic in New York with a lot of Jewish patients. So she's a clinical psychologist helping people with mental illness. And one of the patients asked if they could celebrate one of the high holy days. And she was saying that typically scientists stay away from spirituality. And she decided, let's do this and see what happens. And a lot of the patients really responded to this. Like they lit up, they came alive, they had this glimmer in their eyes, and it inspired her to investigate the question, is there a correlation between spirituality and mental health?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really fascinating topic. She also interweaves her own personal story in the book. So she starts out with doing correlations, and then she goes into then eventually ends up looking at brain structures.
So I'm just curious, like, how did she get like an entirely Jewish population of patients? That's interesting.
I think it just has to do with the neighborhood. In like certain neighborhoods in New York
Ah, okay.
have like a specific ethnicity.
Right. And they probably had, like word of mouth too. Like someone had a good experience and they'll tell their friends or something. Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. And so it's the new science.
Relatively new. I mean, this was published, I think, in 21. Yeah,
Oh, I
2021.
mean, that's very new.
And she's been doing this work for, I don't know, 15 years, maybe more.
Yeah. I don't think there's been a lot of science at all on like spiritual experiences and things like that. I think the closest some people have come to is like these near-death kinds of things, or maybe, how different kinds of drugs that are associated with like rituals or can affect the brain function, but nothing like this. So I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, I've heard of studies on like mindfulness training
Yes.
and seeing how that affects people. But this was specifically talking about she goes into a bunch of different things, but like spiritual individuation is something she talked about. So she distinguishes religious belief and practice from spiritual experience. And then she has, correlations between, which one is more effective and why. I don't remember all the details, but that was really interesting. And she had another idea which I really liked, which she called spiritual individuation, where you figure out, what does the spiritual practice mean to you as an individual, and how does that affect your life?
So is it a practice specifically, like some kind of ritual, or is it some value that you hold that you live your life by?
Both,
Both.
yeah. And she had like 3 different categories
Mhm.
in her one of her experiments, or surveys, and I forget what it was, but one was just the belief, and the other one was the experience. And there was also like sense of connection to a higher power, sense of meaning and purpose in life, and then spiritual practice like prayer, meditation.
Well, I mean, one of these things what I think is good evidence is if something is kind of hardwired, let's say, into the human brain, is if it just pops up spontaneously across cultures.
Yeah,
And religion certainly does that.
yeah.
It's all over the place. And interestingly enough, they all kind of have similar basic guidelines. And the rituals can vary drastically in terms of what they're actually doing, but the meaning of why they do those things might be similar.
Yeah, and that was her conclusion, was that spirituality is part of human nature. And in the same way that we have an instinct for language, we have an instinct for spirituality. And what she also discovered is that people who were prone to depression were also prone to spirituality. and that spirituality can be curative for those people. It can
Hmm.
be preventative and curative for those
Hmm.
people.
So they're prone. So people who are spiritual are prone to depression, and then the spirituality can also help them with it.
Forget the Venn diagram, but
There's some overlap.
yeah. So for some people who have a propensity towards depression, that spirituality can help
Mm-hmm.
pull them out of it or keep them out of it, like prevent them from going there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories where people go to, these ceremonies, ayahuasca ceremonies, and it can be like your business type person who's just struggling and just wants to see what it's like, right? And sometimes I've heard some pretty amazing stories. Other times it was just like whatever, and other times it was like that was the craziest thing.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's the Venn diagram is large, I think, and
Mhm.
people respond differently. Yeah.
Mhm.
But on the whole, I do think religion is important um, for human society. So there's also one interesting thing since we're talking about religion and science is I've heard the idea, I don't know where I heard this from, but I heard the idea that part of the reason religion comes about is that there's some kind of innate need to explain things,
Mhm.
or because we have a prefrontal cortex and we can like make a simulation about what could happen in the future. That ability necessitates like thinking about, okay, what happens after you die? And that's like maybe the foundation of spirituality. And then being able to imagine some kind of future state. Um,
There's a guy by the name of Ernest Becker,
hmm,
and he wrote this book called I think it's called The Anxiety of Death. And his whole theory is that our cultures, our way of coping with the fear of death.
hmm,
It's called and death anxiety theorists study this, and like they do experiments where they like remind people of their mortality and see how they respond.
hmm,
And my understanding is it didn't really take off in psychology,
hmm,
but it's definitely an interesting idea. And the denial of death, that's what the name of the book is.
hmm.
He has a bunch of books, but that's like the big one.
Yeah. And I also think that religion, almost every religion across cultures, that's a big focus. What
Mhm.
happens after you die? How
Mhm.
explaining
Mhm.
kind of that. Um, and they also all have like a how should you behave now so that you'll have a better afterlife or whatever
Mhm.
with if it's Hinduism, but if you have good karma now, then you'll be a higher order animal in your next reincarnation or something,
Mhm.
right?
Well, two things. So one, I wanted to rewind a little bit to the
Hmm.
previous idea about spirituality being curative.
Okay.
I know in the 12 steps program, one of the things they require is belief in a higher power. And
Hmm.
it turns out that seems to be necessary for people to recover, which is interesting.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Or
I think, well, there's two reasons, maybe. One is that, you don't have the faith or the courage to do it on your own.
yeah.
So if you believe that someone cares about you, is going to help you through it, then you'll be more likely to follow through. And the second thing is if you believe this thing loves you and cares about you, it can be a sort of vicarious compassion that
Hmm.
you're worth improving, or you're,
Hmm.
you're worth having a better life.
Yeah. Another thought is maybe it's also kind of like a locus of control thing. Like if there's this higher power, all knowing, they kind of are holding some of the responsibility for you. It's not everything that's happening isn't like your fault.
Mm.
It's the universe has some part to play, and the universe will also help you out.
Mhm, mhm. Could be.
Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing is I should have marked the page, but she said there were like three components to spirituality, at least in her map.
Hmm.
And one was belief in a higher power rooted in compassion. Another was a sense of oneness or connection to to all life.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one was something like meaningful, like guidance.
Hmm.
And she was arguing that those are the three things that are universal in religions,
Hmm.
and that those constitute the spiritual experience of the what she calls the awakened brain.
Okay, yeah. But being a clinical psychologist, it sounds like she also has a special interest in the beneficial, like therapeutic effects.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, therapeutic and preventative effects.
Yeah.
And she's done experiments and like network with other people doing experiments to show the effectiveness, which I think is really cool. And she points out that it's kind of the holy grail where you could have the secular humanist science validating the
Mm,
spiritual practices.
right. And it's not necessarily saying that, the facts of the religion are true, but it's just showing clinically, look, this makes a difference in people's lives.
Yeah.
And you can't refute that.
Mhm.
Like, even if like all these religions can't be true if you go down to each fact because they're just contradictory. But
Right.
they have a central thing that seems to be important and it hangs around.
Mhm.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's really cool. Jimmy recommended this book to me, by the
Oh,
way.
cool.
Mhm.
Okay, nice. So let's see. Do you
I'll put a
remember?
link in the description.
Yeah. Did she mention anything about you said brain structures? Do you remember anything about that or
I could look it up. She
okay.
she she did list them, and she talked about, let's see, top-down attention system and the bottom-up perception. Um, this is where we should pause it or edit it, or I should take notes ahead of time.
Now we're winging it. That'd be good practice for editing.
Right? Let's see. Yeah, so first she started with the clinical stuff, and then she like moved into the brain stuff, oh, cognitive stuff too. Yeah, so she listed the different parts of the brain that were activated
During
during like meditation,
meditation.
or I think she was talking about alpha waves too.
Hmm. Yep. Default network. Did you mention that?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not super critical. We can maybe check it out later. But there are some correlations to these. So did she do any kind of like drug administration and test as well? Because I
I,
know there are some studies that have done that.
I don't think she did any
Hmm.
drugs.
Hmm. Because there are a lot of new studies coming out now talking about like ketamine, um, and then therapy in combination, and it's like shockingly effective.
Mhm.
Um, that and also MDMA, ecstasy,
Mhm.
and both of these could kind of have like that spiritual component, I guess, some kind of oneness. I don't know because I've never done these drugs, but so I've been told.
Here's they say the neural structure for those whom spirituality and religion held medium, low, or no importance. Okay. So the MRI would come to be called the red brain or the high spiritual brain,
Hmm.
um, with broad and pervasive regions of cortical thickness.
Okay.
I remember
Yeah.
talking about that.
Yeah. I'm not huge on the literature of the brain size stuff. Like if it's just anatomical. If it was like a functional MRI,
Mhm.
that's it carries a little more weight for me personally.
Mhm. Yeah, so she listed, if I remember correctly, she listed like I honestly didn't pay attention too much of the brain structure stuff.
Mhm.
Maybe I should have.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's what I'm interested.
Yeah, for sure. My bad.
No, it's no good. No good. So have you finished it?
Yeah.
Oh, you did. Okay. So what was that? Would you call it the individuated spirituality?
Yeah, that's
What
what
is
she
that?
calls it.
Yeah, what is that?
That's when you figure out what your spirituality means to you as a person.
Hmm. Oh, okay. So there's like religion, which I think is like a cultural phenomenon, right?
Okay, hold on. Sorry, I
Mm-hmm.
found it. So spiritual narratives have a deactivation, a powering down of the default mode network,
Mm-hmm.
which she calls the rumination box. And the dorsal attention network is our top-down attention.
Okay.
And when inhibitory filter is released, our ventral attention network or bottom-up attention takes over.
Hmm. I'm not sure about the top down and bottom up attention. I know of like dorsal ventral streams of vision per se,
Mhm.
but I don't know about this attention.
Well, I've heard it called differently, like focused attention and diffuse mode,
Hmm.
where you're like, so this goes into math education, where you're
Mhm.
like intensely focused on something, you're using like your rational mind, and that's what people normally think about when they're doing math.
Mhm.
It turns out it's also important to have diffuse mode where you're just kind of daydreaming and letting your ideas wander.
Mhm.
And that's partly what people think dreams are for. It's like this
Mhm.
association, which is a necessary part of brain functioning. But you could also you could do this in a structured way where you like study intensely for 50 minutes and then like daydream for 10
Mhm.
minutes. And frequently in that daydream, like ideas will just come to you
Right.
that won't get there when you're focused. So that's the idea of like to me, that's the idea of the focus mode versus like the unconscious, if you want to think about it that way.
Mhm.
The
Interesting.
bottom up attention.
Yeah. And that also seems to be a very consistent thing across different kinds of religions or spirituality, some kind of meditating prayer or some this like open state that you're talking about, I feel like.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I this is all the brain stuff, and I didn't underline it as much, but she says we saw increased activation in the posterior cingulate cortex
Hmm.
and reduced activation in the inferior parietal lobe,
Hmm.
where we navigate perceived distinctions between self and others.
Hmm.
The parietal is linked to two key cognitive functions, perceiving and representing the self and others in time and space, and attributing agency. It's like the theory of mind stuff, with left parietal activity signaling an attribution of agency outside oneself. The fMRI findings showed that in a spiritual state, the parietal shifts from unrelenting strong use of a pulsing or moderating use. The engagement of the parietal is what caused the brain to perceive separation.
Hmm. Interesting.
In a spiritual experience, hard fixed boundaries soften. Feelings of separateness diminish. We embrace sensation and transcendence and union.
Yeah, I don't know a lot of the human literature, but that's really fascinating.
Yeah, so she talks about achieving awareness, which is like the focus mode, right? You want to
Hmm.
get stuff done. And then the, what should call it? The awakened awareness. That's
Hmm.
when you have like the spiritual mode. Yeah, perceiving yourself on the path, feeling more connected, making creative leaps, feeling more in tune with life's purpose and meaning. And then when you're in the flow of life, paying attention to doors opening and closing.
Hmm. Huh. And you said she didn't actually set out to do this. It just kind of became a thing because one of her patients is like, "Hey, I'd like to do this
Yeah.
celebration or
And
observance."
yeah, and it seemed really beneficial. And then she thought, hey, I wonder if there's something to this.
Hmm.
And then she has her personal story of where she um she wanted to have kids,
Mm.
and she went to all these fertility clinics and wasn't really working. And then she ended up adopting, but then also ended up having a kid anyway.
Mm.
And the way she describes it, it was this synchronicity that seemed to have a powerful meaning for her.
Mm.
And so, and she also talks about these people that she met along the way that were doing similar research, and how that contributed to her journey. So she's not just like, she started out like observing it, and the
Mhm.
science seems solid, but she's also living it too.
Yeah.
Like once she figured this stuff out, she's like, well, maybe I should be having spiritual practice, and
Hmm.
maybe I should be more attuned to this stuff.
Right. Wow, it's very open-minded of her then. Hmm. Very cool.
Yeah.
So in terms of like, I always just go kind of big picture,
Mhm.
thinking about like cross-cultural religions and things like that. Do you mind if maybe we go in that direction
Sure.
in terms of
Yeah,
discussion?
I'm totally interested in that stuff.
Right, like in the different, so what are some of the most common like cross-cultural religious ideas? So like I think we already talked about probably some kind of explanation of an afterlife
Mhm.
or what happens after you die is pretty universal.
Mhm.
Um, what else?
Well, practices are one thing and beliefs are another.
Hmm.
And, Joseph Campbell has the whole monomyth idea, which is that all the myths of the world are really just one story, and they're different sort of accents or variation on the one story.
Hmm.
And he argues that this happens because we have, and this is Carl Jung's idea too, that we have similar structure in terms of psyche, so
Hmm.
it makes sense that we'd have similar narratives and mythologies that give us a map for how to live.
Okay, so maybe that's a second or another aspect of these religions is some map of how to live.
Mhm.
So be it, Judaism, Christianity, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. It's all kind of like how you should conduct yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and then also some kind of explanation of an afterlife. So with this, so what's like, can you go into the monomyth? Like what's the most prevalent across cultures? Is it the hero's journey?
Exactly. Yeah, the hero's journey.
Hmm.
And the idea is that that's a developmental model, right?
Mm.
People, when they go from adolescence into adulthood, there's this rite of passage, there's this transition that's necessary for adults, and that's captured in the hero's journey. And
Hmm.
then you have the archetype of like the mentor and the guide, and then you have a battle, and then you have an understanding of the goddess, or what it means to serve woman, and then you have the
Mm.
discovery, and bringing it back to the tribe.
Yeah. That's interesting though that you mentioned like the adolescence. There's like some transitional transformation that happens
Mhm.
always in these stories, right?
Well, and culturally, historically, there's always a rite of passage
Hmm.
into adulthood, so that okay, it's especially necessary for men because women have their first period. It's called a menarche,
Mm.
and when that happens, it's like, okay, nature calls, you're a woman now.
Yeah.
But for adolescent boys, it's not obvious. Like, when are you a man? And the
Right.
idea is that the culture creates a structure so you can say, okay, after this moment, you're a man.
Hmm.
Now you're taking on the responsibilities of adult manhood.
Right. So it's like if you go out hunting and you shoot, kill your first whatever, like now
Right,
you're a man
right,
with a bow and arrow, or you do some other kind of crazy stuff.
right.
Yeah. I think that is lacking in modern culture, especially for men.
Yes,
There's no
100%.
clear, other than maybe graduating high school or something like that, but everyone does that. Well, not
Mhm.
necessarily, but and it's not the same thing. Um, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we talked about this last time. I don't remember, but our culture is neurotic in the sense that we're trying to do that. Like, you're an adult when you're at 18,
Hmm.
but actually no, you can't. you're actually an adult when you're 21, because
Mm,
that's when you can buy alcohol. Like you can vote, but you can't buy alcohol.
right.
And it's like, well, no, actually, you're an adult when you graduate college.
Hmm.
So we should treat college kids like they're kids instead of treating them like they're adults.
Right.
And so there's all these different disagreements within the culture of like, okay, where do we draw the line for
Right.
adulthood?
And at 15, you can start driving a car too. And so
Yeah,
there's this huge range.
yeah, it's it's
Yeah.
it's it's neurotic, and it's also difficult because like in a hunter-gatherer society, your job is to hunt.
Hmm.
Like that's basically it. I mean, you defend, there's this like warrior aspect too of defending the tribe, but fundamentally you hunt. And when you're able to hunt and provide and defend, okay, you're an adult. In our society, that's we have making money as a proxy for hunting.
Hmm.
And you could argue that, once you're making money, you're an adult. Um, but then there's also this question of gender too,
Mm.
where men and women are both in the workforce, and it's we have electric money, like
Yeah.
so it's we're very abstracted from our roots.
Right. So there's, I guess there's, how then do people deal with that? It's going to create some kind of void or something, right? And could probably causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, even it's unconscious,
Mhm.
like on a spiritual level. It's like, yeah. So do you see that playing out?
Well, in some ways, you could argue that's one of the appeals of gangs,
Mm.
right? Because you get this like masculine brotherhood. There's this
Hmm.
initiation ceremony, right? You're jumped in,
Hmm.
and then you belong, and you've got your homies, and you have a reason and a mission and a
Hmm.
tribe, and that's absolutely filling that need, I think.
Hmm.
Another place it shows up is in the military, right? People go
Hmm.
to the military, they go through boot camp, and then you're part of a tribe.
Right. Kind of the Jocko
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
mentality,
And
loyalty and brotherhood.
mhm,
Yeah.
right. And that could happen in college. There's what do they call them? The
Fraternities?
yes, exactly, the Greek stuff.
Hmm.
Right. And historically, right, there's a hazing, and
Hmm.
then you get bullied around. It's supposed to toughen you up, and it's a similar
Right.
kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. And that might just be because, the cultures and society becoming less and less traditionally religious or spiritual.
Right.
So it's like these things, they're still inside people and they need to come out in some way. So those are maybe just natural ways that they come out.
Right. The psychological need like needs to be met.
Yeah.
And so they're met in these irreligious ways.
Right. Yeah, I think that is sensible to me. Um, and it only makes sense. Like since I mean religions have been around for so long, there's a lot of thinkers that think, oh, religion is just this outdated relic and it's not needed anymore. But to me, that's okay. Maybe like the specific practices and nuances of what religions put out, okay, but there's still that like spiritual need
Mhm.
that's in there,
Right.
and what that is pretty confusing as well.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the points she made in this book is that a lot of well, I don't remember if she said it's specifically Freudian, but a lot of um approaches to like clinical practice have this assumption that religion is a delusion,
Mm.
and you need to get over your denial, and your therapy is to face the harsh truth, and
Hmm.
you need to abandon this spirituality stuff. And she's saying, no, like this is necessary and it helps people, and it gives them meaning to their life, and it buttress against depression, and it's vital. Okay, that's but a pretty cool argument.
Yeah, just a lot of these religions can get messed up with like jihad and killing and hate for specific people and just like, some of these things when they're put into practice. I'm sure it was had some utility to organize people in some way early on, but those kinds of things I feel like are not helpful.
Well, and this was one of the points between Sam Harris and Jordan
Hmm.
Peterson And so Sam Harris essentially is, one famous atheist saying we need to get rid of religion precisely because of, jihads
Mhm.
and
Holy
genital
wars.
mutilations
Yeah.
and, witch burnings and all this stuff.
Chopping off your hands and yeah.
Right. And Peterson's point was that atrocities happen under communism and atrocities happen under Nazism. These are ideologies. They are irreligious ideologies, but they are belief systems that tap into this tribal instinct that
Mhm.
people have. As you mentioned, it's a way of organizing people.
Mhm.
So it's not, his point was, it's not the religion per se that's the problem. It's out of control tribalism that's the problem.
Yeah. That's a thing too. I think we did talk about this before, but this tribalism mentality could have been one of the reasons why humans have been so successful.
Yeah,
So it's like a double-edged sword.
right.
Um,
And this is my pondering. Personally, I don't feel like I belong to a tribe,
mhm.
which is it's very isolating.
Mm,
And some have said that having a tribal identity is part of a developmental stage. Like
mm,
you're supposed to feel like part of a tribe as you get older.
yeah.
And if you don't, it's potentially a deficit.
Mhm.
So in the same way that we might have an instinctual need for spirituality, we also may have an instinctual need for tribalism.
Mhm.
And that if we say, well, let's just get rid of this superstitious nonsense and let's just make sure we kill tribalism completely, that
Mhm.
might have some negative consequences for
Yeah.
people's sense of well-being.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the next idea as well, you could have tribalism that's not as violent. For example, sports. People get super into their
Oh yeah.
football in America, and it's
Right.
like, I am a Steelers fan to the core,
Right.
and that's just part of their tribal
And
identity.
there's almost like religious too, in that they put on the war paint and they have the colors and everything. It's like
Yeah,
literally like a religion.
yeah, and or like the warpath or something.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you've heard about the studies where people get like elevated testosterone when their team wins and they're
Mhm.
just vicariously in the battle, even though they're not actually
Right.
participating in the sport.
Oh yeah, yeah. Like I've heard stories of I think some of the craziest groups are these like soccer hooligans.
Mhm.
Have you heard of these like in the UK or whatever? Like they'll just like tear down the whole like bleacher thing and it just gets nuts.
I remember when I was in Mexico City, they had like the fans on opposite sides of the stadium.
Yeah. Just like for safety. Shoot. People be crazy.
But it's the tribalism, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's what it is. And but that's one way that the tribalism could be channeled in a helpful.
Hmm.
And there's a meta ethic, right? Sportsmanship. The idea
Hmm.
is like we're gonna battle this out. At the end of the game, we're gonna shake hands
Yeah,
because what matters is the game, not necessarily the battle.
definitely. Wasn't that part of the idea of like why the Olympics
Yeah,
was
exactly.
put in? It's like
Mhm.
let's compete, put our best warriors out there or whatever, and see how it goes. And afterwards, we'll see you again in 4 years or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's very exciting too. Like, I've been to like Dota international tournaments and usually caught up in it.
mhm.
And it's cool to see like your guy do the awesome maneuver or whatever. And then there's like a sense of dread when he makes a mistake and your whole team gets wiped out. It's like so you ride the roller coaster on both sides.
Yeah,
And then your comrades are feeling the same thing. So it's like a sense of this tribal thing.
yeah, for sure.
Like a part of something.
Like my one critique of that whole experience is that the the team structure is a little loose.
Hmm.
And people would be on Navi and then they'd get like transferred to another team and then that
Yeah,
player would go to another team. And at least for me, that sense of tribal loyalty was disrupted because it was just kind of a little
yeah.
too loose.
It is in terms of the individual teams, but what ends up happening, especially like these international tournaments, is it kind of becomes like the US versus China. So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Liquid and
Like Liquid is
is the US.
European.
No, I think it's US. Well, they've got a
Or
couple.
Navi, that was the one that was
Navi is
like
definitely a European.
Scandinavian or
Yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah. And then right, then they had all these Chinese teams, and then it basically you could tell because like when the Chinese team did something well, the whole side of the stadium went wild, and the other team went well. So it was you definitely got that. So there was still some separation, but I do agree there's a lot of, especially in those online games, there's not a lot of structure yet, but I think that's only gonna get bigger. Yeah, that was really, really interesting. So religion into tribalism, those things are important, but maybe not so much the superstition kinds of things. And I think that's what also I was like mentioning too, is like a lot of the reasons like some of these like superstitions come up is that also I think the human brains are kind of wired, one, to kind of problem solve and like have this prefrontal cortex where they can imagine what's happening in the future and predict. Like you want to be able to predict and error correct. And humans are really good at making correlations of like if they see something happen at the same time as something's happening, there must be like some cause there. So then you get into this like astrology thing of, oh, when that star is up, and then that's how these people are behaving. And then these superstitions get created.
Astrology is an interesting one because it has longevity,
Still around.
Right. Well,
in modern times.
and it seems to lend itself to credibility because it's been around for so long. Like it's been around almost as long as mathematics. So that's interesting. And then
arguably before, like this, I mean, the sky has always been up there at night, and I'm sure like prehistoric humans were probably pretty interested in what was going on up there and trying to make connections. But or like like the whole like full moon thing with the werewolves. That's also I think across cultures. When you're a lunatic, I don't know if it's true, but that's like a correlation that people make. Turn into a monster in the evening.
the skinwalkers.
Skinwalkers, what's that?
That's a Native American
Oh,
story.
okay.
Essentially the werewolf kind of story. Like someone's a shapeshifter.
Uh-huh. Got it. Okay. I thought this was like some underworld, like a daywalker vampire thing. I don't know. Skinwalker. Yikes. That does sound pretty creepy. Can you go back a little bit to like the hero's journey and some of
Yeah.
these like myths?
Yeah.
So one thing which I wish I knew more about, and maybe you do, but it seems like this flood idea is found in a lot of different religions, the story of a flood. What is that? That seems weird to me.
Um,
Do you have any? Well, first of all, is that perception accurate?
I think it is, yeah.
Okay. I don't know where I heard it, but it seems like in every major religion or in these traditions of myths and legends, it's like a flood is a big deal, but not as much like earthquakes or other natural disasters.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I could theorize. One is if you buy into the psychoanalytic idea that a lot of this stuff is motivated by dreams. Water is a primordial symbol, and like we're grown in utero in water, and we need water to survive, and so there's this like deep connection to water, and water is also a symbol of chaos. And if you have a society that's in chaos, the way you'd symbolize that is with a flood.
Right, and usually the flood is devastating, right? It's not so that's interesting. It's that it's chaotic, it's life-giving, but it also can kill everyone. That's interesting.
Now, there's anthropological explanation, which says that most civilizations started in river valleys, whether it be the Nile in Egypt or the Yellow River in India or China rather, and one of the things about rivers is that they flood, and if that's like your experience of agriculture. It's like this river gives us fertile land, but it also floods and wipes us out every
Yeah.
now and then.
I like that explanation better. Personally, that makes sense to me. Like people are living near water to survive because they must. And it doesn't matter where you are, you'll get hit with a flood and it's horrible. And so the legends of a great flood that is so big, and that's also a possibility too, right?
It is,
That,
and
that
this
there was a great, like maybe an asteroid impact and just crazy tsunami goes everywhere or something.
right. And then, well, then you get situations like, the Inuit in Alaska
Mhm.
have stories of floods, but like their world is,
Ice.
yeah, like fish and whale blubber.
Right.
But it's still in the story. So
Right.
the fact that it's universal, it's interesting.
Yeah. So that's just one that came to my mind that just seems super fascinating. Because the hero journey is one, right? Where you have this like transformation from, younger child into adult. That's kind of like the general theme of the hero's journey with all these different kinds of things. But then there are these specific kinds of stories that have like the great disaster. Is there other ones? Like there's like a great flood kind of story or some kind of big disaster. Are there other kinds of stories that are pretty common that involve?
Oh man. I mean, Campbell catalogs these in categories in the Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Mhm.
So not only they're like types, but they're like, yeah, different categories. Um,
Or there's a lot of like Jesus-like figures too, right?
Jesus is interesting because he's a combination of a lot of different figures.
Mm-hmm.
And well, for example, in the Old Testament, you have David,
Mm-hmm.
and David was a shepherd,
Mm-hmm.
but he was also a warrior, and he was also a poet, and then he was also a king.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty unusual for a person to be, a shepherd, a warrior, a poet, and a king.
Right.
That's like four careers combined into one person.
Mm-hmm.
And you have something like that in Christ too, where
Mm-hmm.
he's a carpenter, he's a healer, he's a teacher, he's a leader,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a king. He has like all of these
Mm-hmm.
different roles in one person.
Yeah. I guess so. Yeah, I mean that all makes sense, but I guess I was thinking more like there's also in most of these religions I can think of, there's usually like a central figure like
Mhm.
that, a prophet like Muhammad or Jesus or Buddha. I don't know, like Hindu probably has something like that, or maybe.
Hinduism is really interesting because it's really diverse, and there are like patterns,
Mm-hmm.
and there are leaders and like gurus and avatars, what they call them. There are
Mm-hmm.
incarnations of deities,
Mm-hmm.
but so there are different deities. You have different incarnations at different times, and are they reincarnations? And it
Mm-hmm.
gets really complicated. And so it's like one of the big ones is Krishna.
Mm-hmm.
And was Krishna a person, or was that a legend?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, you go so far back, it's hard to know.
Right. To me, I'm more leaning with like the idea of some Krishna is more important than if it was actually ever a person.
Right. But
Like or like
and
Jesus or any of these other kinds.
right, you have a similar thing with like King Arthur. Like,
Mm-hmm.
was there actually a King Arthur, or does it not matter? What matters is the idea of the just king that's going to bring freedom.
Right. Yeah, and I do feel like in most of these kinds of religion, that's another common thread. I mean, obviously, when you have like the hero with a thousand faces or like the flood, the flood's not everything, but it takes a large portion of the Venn diagram overlap.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean that's it has to be there for a reason. I think it does offer up this tribal thing that can group people, which is good. Can help people, that have issues when they don't have that spiritual experience. You can't just get rid of it, which is where a lot of the like modern intellectual elite kind of culture is going.
Yeah. What's also interesting to me is this idea of modeling, the idea that young people admire, and Peterson talks about this, how admiration is part of the instinct for imitation.
Hmm.
That if you admire somebody, that means you at some level want to imitate them.
Mhm.
It's like a calling. And in terms of these stories, it's really interesting because Christians say, what would Jesus do? And the
Mhm.
idea is that a Christian should try to imitate Christ.
Right.
So, is this person just like an ideal, or are they a model that you're aspiring to?
Mhm.
And you could argue that role models are really important
Yeah.
developmentally and personally, for sure.
Right. It definitely makes life more navigable if you have like a target.
Mhm.
Like when you're a kid, you're obviously looking up to your parents, right? And they're your role models. And basically, I don't know, it's like kindergarten or first grade. You ask the kid, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Like 99%, it's like whatever their dad or their mom is doing,
Mhm.
just because that's the immediate connection. So it's like almost like a Christ-like figure or Buddha or something. It's like that's something to aspire to, even
Mhm.
though maybe these people didn't really exist, or the idea is more important. The ideal is more important.
Yeah, it's interesting because then and I think about this, like there's also this idea of leadership,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if someone's a leader, the point is to follow them
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily imitate them. I mean, maybe, but there's also this problem of but too many cooks in the kitchen, or too many chiefs and not enough Indians.
Mm.
Like some people are going to be the leaders, and then some people are going to be the followers,
Mm-hmm.
and how that like hierarchy structure plays out is also an interesting question.
Yeah. I think religion can go bad when it starts getting really tied into like politics and like international foreign relations. That's when it can get really dicey.
Hmm.
These kind of like crusades, like when the Pope is having a more pull than the king in some, when like in Europe.
Mhm.
So, and yeah, when you're in those positions, when you're high up in the hierarchy, it doesn't matter if it's like a spiritual or religious group. You can get corrupted by that kind of power, and you can basically convince people to do all sorts of horrible things
Mhm.
under the name of something that's really helpful or can be,
Mhm.
which is the downside. But I don't think it's unique to religion. It's just unique to um, abuse of power in any sector, I
Mhm.
think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And maybe it's just part of human nature. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
and this is definitely Peterson's argument. It's like, nature is beautiful and terrifying,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have sunsets and you have plagues,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just part of nature. And then he argues culture supports us, right? Culture gives us a scaffolding to live, but it's also oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the two aspects of culture you can't get away from.
Right. Right. It's tempting to think, well, why can't we just control every variable and make a utopia? Keep the good things, get rid of the bad things. And almost every single movie or story that tries to do this, it ends up backfiring horribly.
Right?
So it's almost like you do need some of that friction in the other way just to have things going properly.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
And I mean, this kind of relates to what we were talking about in our first episode. Like, you could have too much cultural control and like
Mhm.
rigidity and tyranny, but if you don't have enough, then it's chaos.
Mhm.
So you've got to have both. And what's the balance there? That's what civilization is trying to figure
Yeah.
out,
The whole yin and yang of life,
or culture at least.
culture.
Yeah,
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to hang it up. What do you think?
yeah. And I'll put a link for the description for the awakened brain for those who are interested.
Cool. All right. Thank you.